The Force is with us today on a Chris and Company, and you will understand why in a second. Welcome in to the show. I think, is this our 25th episode? Is this our quarter century mark? Sorry, dead air, visual bit for the radio here. Yes, this is episode 25, which is very exciting. So we've made it. We're a quarter of the way to that century mark, and we have a fun interview lined up, much different than anything that we've done in the past. But this is where I got to give credit to Austin. Me and him, but especially him over the last few months, we've been the internet equivalent of cold calling people, just trying to get them to do this show and seeing who bounces back and who responds. And we got a response from Nick Gillard. You may not know the name. If you're not a huge Star Wars fan, you may not know the face, but you definitely know what he's been a part of. He's been working in Hollywood for a long time, but he is the mastermind behind the incredibly intense, incredibly fast, well choreographed fight scenes of the Star Wars prequels. This is a guy who has a lot of really cool stories. He had exclusive access to George Lucas all throughout the making of those films. I mean, I like good storytellers, and I like guys who have metaphorically seen some shit. And I think that's one of the reasons why athlete stories appeal to me, guys who've been in clubhouses. But you're talking about somebody who's been a part of and been on the inside for one of the biggest brands in the history of the world. And as much as I've, I'll be critical of Star Wars, especially modern Star Wars and the prequel era as well, I've accepted for a while that I cannot deny the importance that those movies had on my life and my imagination. And just to be able to talk to somebody who was a piece of that was very special. And we'll recap the interview when we're done here. But before we get to it, just want to say, if you're listening to this on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, make sure to subscribe, write us a positive review. If you're watching on YouTube, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, share this. Wow, sorry, I'm talking over myself. It's the morning. Share this with your friends. Hit that little bell button. That way you'll get notified every single time that I upload a video to this account, whether it's Chris and Company or otherwise. And shout out to Austin, continuing to do a remarkable job with the production as we continue to roll along here. But I'm looking forward to this, and I'm looking forward to see how this one is received. Every so often, I do something where I don't know what the reception to it will be, but I'm very excited for it, and I'm very proud of it. And I think this is one of those interviews. So without further ado, let's get to our interview with Nick Gillard. Chris Company rolls on, and we got a special one today, and it's a little bit different than what we're used to with our interviews. But Austin was able to find a really cool guest, and it's a nostalgic thing for him and for me. And it's a real honor today. We are joined by Nick Gillard. For people to simplify, those really, really cool lightsaber fights that you saw in the Star Wars prequels, many of them were his doing. They were all his doing. He is responsible for choreographing the incredibly fast-paced, incredibly cool fight scenes from the Star Wars prequels. As somebody who probably watched the behind-the-scenes documentaries of the prequels front to back a million times, this is a very cool moment for this podcast. So, Nick, we really appreciate you doing this.
You're welcome. I wish I'd watched those behind-the-scene things.
Well, you didn't. You lived them. I mean, you didn't. You went through it all on your own. So I mean, it was probably it might not have been as interesting for you. But let's go back, and this is gonna be one of these episodes, man, that's gonna make me feel old, because I remember seeing the prequels in theaters. I remember the anticipation for them, and now it's. I mean, a few months ago I was in the theater for the 25th anniversary of Phantom Menace. I mean, it's crazy how quickly time flies. Yeah. Though they re-released it. Nationally, it did well at the box office. It was top 5 at the box office, and it was the first time. Now, I saw it. I was sitting on my mother's lap when I first saw it in theaters, so I didn't have a whole lot of memories. But it was the first time I'd seen the film in a packed theater with people, at a much different time in my life. My producer and I went to go see it. It was really a cool experience. But let's go back even before the release of these movies. So we're talking probably 1997 here, roughly. At what point were you approached to be the fight choreographer for the prequels?
I've been working for them on Young Indiana Jones Chronicles. And I was going out to San Francisco for something or other. I don't know. I can't remember what it was, but I don't know if they still do in those days. They give you stuff to carry with you, that doesn't have to go in a bag or something, usually paperwork. And they gave me an envelope to drop off at Lucasfilm, which was open, and so I looked in there, obviously, when I was on the plane. And it was, I couldn't work it out. It was the storyboards for the pod race for Phantom Menace, but I couldn't, nobody knew then that they were going to make another Star Wars. So the only thing, it just said SW, and I'm thinking, that's got to be, that looks. And shortly after that, when I got there, I told them that I'd opened it and what were they. And Rick McCallum, who was the producer, said, well, let's talk about that.
That's, it's so unique how, and this is one of the things I love about the prequels and that era, is that it wasn't pre-internet. Like, the internet was around, but the idea of there was so much more secrecy to filmmaking back then than there is today, where it's like that stuff. I mean, that still would have leaked online in 5 seconds. And, there's the famous story of people going to the theater to watch the trailer for Phantom Menace and then leaving after before the movie even started, where I think it was Meet Joe Black was the 1998 movie that had the trailer for Phantom Menace. As fun as it is to have access to things on the internet, I do kind of yearn for those days. I think that's really cool to have that kind of.
You're absolutely right. Attack of the Clones, and they were on it quite quick. So it wasn't until Attack of the Clones that suddenly there's a guy called Pablo. Right? He's much more important now at Lucasfilm, but then that's what he did. He turned up in our rehearsal space with a webcam, and pointed at us, and we knew nothing about it. What is that thing? Yeah,
it's crazy how time.
It really was the transition time. I hadn't thought about it, and it's the same with kind of mobile phone technology then as well. They were pretty basic back then.
I think that there is something. I mean, Star Wars is so polarizing and important for so many people, but I think there is something about the era in which the prequels were released, is they were kind of the last films or film series to have that sort of mystique pre-internet. And obviously by the time you got to Revenge of the Sith, you had the internet was much more popular, but still it was not what it is today. Now, I was going back and watching some interviews with you about what you wanted these fight scenes to look like, and the way that you described them, and I thought this was fascinating, was a game of chess played at 1,000 miles per hour in which every move is a check. And going back and watching some of these fights, it's like that's kind of a perfect description for what these were. Was there any, while you're coming up with the idea of how these are going to look, was there any fear at all of these potentially being too fast to a point where maybe it felt robotic and potentially almost inhuman?
No, not really. We had such a long rehearsal time that, I had an idea of how I wanted it to look anyway. And then with the amount of rehearsal time, we could just run it and get it absolutely perfect. Mm-hmm. What we thought was perfect. No, I think it was a pretty easy thing to do.
That's cool.
Better than that.
No, that's totally fine. No, it's an honest answer, because I think, I brought up obviously with it being kind of pre-internet, I think one of the coolest parts of not just Phantom Menace, but to me of any Star Wars film, was the Duel of the Fates fight sequence. And that was one of those things where if it happened today, we'd see a clip of it online before, the film came out. But outside of knowing that Darth Maul had that dual-bladed lightsaber, that was really all we saw of the fight before we went to see the film in theaters, and people were kind of blown away from that sequence. And what I love about it is I describe it, it's like a perfect dance of all these moving parts coming together, with the actors being completely committed, Ray Park's brilliant stunt work, your incredible choreography, but a huge piece of it is John Williams' iconic score. I'm just curious, you're just responsible for choreographing the fights. When was the first time you heard that score and knew that it was going to be part of the accompaniment for that scene?
Do you know, I didn't know, but
Wow.
Strangely, George was over. This was, way after we'd finished, and George was in London, and I had arranged to meet him for lunch. And it was at Abbey Road, the recording studios where the Beatles did all of their stuff, where everybody did all their stuff. And that's what I knew. So I walked in there, and they actually had that scene up in the main, I don't know what studio it was, the big one. So they had that fight up with a full orchestra and John Williams, and they're rocking to it. That was a hell of a thing to see, a full orchestra play it and hear how they do it, and stop and they're looking at it, and he's explaining to them, and you need more strings, unbelievable.
It's one of the most impactful, like haunting orchestral scores ever put together on a film. And I mean, like I said, it's a perfect dance where if you remove a single element of that scene, it works, but it doesn't work as well as it would with all of those pieces coming together. It really is an incredible sequence. There's such a mystique to George Lucas as a person, and always kind of what's going on in that imagination. And you had the ability, you had pretty unprecedented access to him with the prequels and the relationship that you have. What is something, having worked with him multiple times, not just on the prequels, but known him before that, what do you feel like is a misconception about George Lucas? What do you feel like is something that the fans get wrong about him?
I don't know. I don't spend a lot of time on the internet, Chris. So I don't,
Sure.
I don't hear bad things about him. But it's George Lucas. That universe is so rich. That said, he is the most normal man you could ever meet. He is so basic, he's quite happy living in a normal house, taking his kids out for a pizza. He's a very normal person outside of what he does.
Yeah, outside of being responsible for a multi-billion-dollar franchise. No, and that's always, in general, that's kind of the reception that people have gotten from him, is that, you see him in interviews, seems like very level-headed, very, very normal. He's just
really
responsible.
level-headed. He doesn't lose his stuff, knows exactly what he wants. Every single part of it. I mean, right down from a spaceship to a screw head on a spaceship, he has an input into it.
Yeah,
there isn't a single thing that he doesn't know about.
Yeah, and I think that's, especially when you watch the kind of behind the scenes with the prequels and with the originals as well, is just the attention to detail throughout the entire series of just, I remember there was a famous one on the Attack of the Clones behind the scenes where somebody calls George to ask him what color is Yoda's blood supposed to be, and he's like, well, it's green. Like, he just has an answer. I think that expansion of the lore has always made things fun.
That's the glory of it, and especially the lore. And the lore is so important. I mean, it really is important. But you look at what's happening now, and the lore is all over the place. But when he's on the set, he is the lore. He's like Judge Dredd.
And there was
so any question that you want, he's got the answer to it. And listen, he doesn't know it all because it's so much. Sometimes you have to correct him. Sometimes he makes mistakes, but he is all over that, every single part of it. He has a little rubber stamp, and it says good, perfect, wanky, which is a good word. You probably don't know in America. And he'll stamp, art department drawings with that. So he's over everything. And the detail is so important. The familiarity, You know, even from the first ones to the prequels, they're very similar. The look is similar. The universe is the same.
For sure. Yeah. And it changes, but yes, you're right. Like there's been a consistency in terms of the look of the universe all the way down to, I mean, we're using some of the same sets from the prequels, from the original films. One thing that I've always found kind of unique is that actors and artists have much different reactions to when they're asked to be a part of Star Wars. In fact, there's some that have very famously turned down the opportunity to either act in the films or direct the films because they love the universe so much. And I don't know if intimidation is the right word necessarily, but they have a hard time saying, like, I want to be a part of it. It's almost as if Star Wars is one of those things where they'd rather kind of step out and be an observer as opposed to seeing how the sausage gets made. Was there any hesitation on your part for that when you got it?
Yeah. No, not for me. I'm a stunt man. You know, of course.
Sure. Yeah. Fair.
We welcome a challenge like that. But you're absolutely right, and it would be fear. There's nothing like, you know, I did all the Indiana Jones movies, all the Alien movies, all the Superman movies, Labyrinth, Sleepy Hollow, 7 years. You know, I've done some movies, and yet no one ever interviews me on those movies. Yeah. You know, it's like you've only ever done Star Wars. And so if you're an actor, that's going to change your career. Ewan McGregor at that time, you know, just finished Trainspotting. He was rock and roll, you know, he was. But you see an interview with him, it'll be Obi-Wan Kenobi. You know, once you're associated with Star Wars, it can destroy you. So I would imagine there's a fear for actors like that. But as I say, if you're a stunt person, that's what you live for, is those kind of challenges.
For sure. And I think that you tapped into something that's correct, which is Star Wars, like any big franchise, when you're in it, it defines you. Like that is, you know,
there's nothing. There's no a Bond movie doesn't even come close to it. You work on a Bond movie, it's massive. You know, you take over a whole town. It doesn't even compete with Star Wars.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you brought up Ewan McGregor, but like at the time Phantom Menace came out, like Liam Neeson was already an established like actor. Like he'd done Schindler's List, he'd done some really impactful films, and yet I'm sure on the street the one thing he gets recognized for is, hey, that's Qui-Gon Jinn.
Yeah, and all of them. It really does define you.
Mm-hmm. What are your you know, there's been eras to Star Wars, which I find very unique, and I feel like every generation kind of has their own trilogy in the films that they grew up on. Have you kept up with the modern age of Star Wars post Disney buyout?
No, I haven't. I mean, my time was the first ones, New Hope. That I was 17 when they came out. When we did Phantom Menace, George told me we're making it for 5 to 14-year-olds. So you're absolutely right. That was that generation. Mm-hmm. Again, we're now into another generation of them. No, I haven't. As I said to you, I don't spend a lot of time on the internet. I don't watch much television. I certainly don't watch drama. So it's not that I don't care anymore, or I'm frightened of giving an opinion. I just don't watch it. I watch Japanese fighting robots and honey badgers. You know, if you're working it all the time, the last thing you want to be watching is drama. I was thinking about it this morning. Like I've come from work this morning on a TV show, and a very dramatic scene we were shooting. But I happened to be standing near two of the actors that were in this scene, and between takes, we were talking about growing tomatoes. Now, so if I go and watch a movie, even Phantom Menace, that's kind of what you remember. You look at, you know, that day, and it's a different memory for us than it would be for you.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up, because I see that a lot with people who are so involved with a certain industry. Like there's a lot of political pundits who say, man, when I go home, the last thing I'm doing is looking at politics stuff, because that's my life. That's my professional 9 to 5. I don't need 24 hours of that.
They call it here a bus driver's holiday, you know.
Nice. Yeah. And you know, we one thing that you alluded to a little bit there of, you know, you haven't really gone back and watched a whole lot of drama because it's like you said, it's your day to day.
You know, I see bits because they send it to me.
Right. But we interview a lot of athletes on this show. And one thing that I always find interesting is often when athletes are out of the game or away from the game, they have a hard time going back and watching current players play because they're very critical of the modern age and say, I would have done this differently. I know like my teammates would have done this differently. As someone who's responsible for choreographing some of the coolest looking fight scenes in cinema history, do you have a hard time watching other fight scenes when you do watch them?
Yeah, I mean, yes, I do. Of course I do. And of course you always think you could do it better. But I also understand that you might do 3 takes and one of them is perfect and the other 2 not so good. It's not in your control which one gets used. The acting performance might be better in one of the other ones. They might use that one, and that means that 3 of the blows miss. They don't seem to care. The director will care more about performance than he will a sword missing slightly. So when I watch other people's work, I am mindful of that they might have been a perfect fight, and yet it just got, messed up in the edit.
Yeah, well, that was going to be my point. Is very often the difference between great execution and not so great execution is the final edit. I mean, if you cut at the wrong moment, it can make an actor look stiff or wooden. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, or a miss can suddenly be there, and there's nothing you can do about that. So, and I've been in that position myself. So it would be wrong of me to diss other people's fights on Star Wars since, because I don't know what was going on the day.
Yeah,
on mine I had a thing with Palpatine where it was a horrendous day and we didn't really know what to do, and I'm not unique in those days.
Yeah, it's one thing about the prequels that made it so much different, obviously, than the original films was the influx of computer effects. And one of the huge examples of that was the Yoda fight sequences in episode 2 and 3. And this might be a very simple man question, but I'm just curious, Yoda, by the time you got to 2 and 3 was a digital effect, right? And so you didn't have a stuntman, you didn't have somebody who was, what involvement did you have in choreography, if any, for that sequence?
We did it. We did Christopher Lee, and ILM did Yoda, but it came up very quickly. Originally it was Anakin and Obi in that fight, I think, or it changed anyway. It changed on the day, so we went there that day to shoot another fight. And George had, decided Yoda wanted to be in it, so he said, "Listen, sorry, but the door's going to open and Yoda's going to come in and he's going to fight Dooku." You got to deal with it. Same, you do sports, they might suddenly, they've got to do another play, they've got to Hail Mary something, So we came up with the moves for Dooku. We found out where Yoda was going to be. He jumped around a lot. We had a little mannequin of him, so ILM would place him where they needed him to be. My guy Kyle Rowling, who was doubling for Dooku, would make beautiful moves and get to those areas. It was actually a terribly easy thing for us to do. So he did certain routines and arrived in certain places. ILM knew us well enough then that they could make Yoda do those fights, the same move, and match into him. So our guy just did a beautiful dance on his own.
Did you find any challenges to being a part of a world that featured so much CG at that point?
No, it's, since I've started in this, but even back in the first Alien, you're starting to get that kind of world. The first movie I ever did, actually, in 1977, which was called The Thief of Baghdad, and it was a sequence with people riding horses fighting a flying carpet, and it was very early CG, really earlier. The whole stage was full of equipment, and they'd had the stunt people in there to do it, and they'd all been thrown off of their horses, because there was so much equipment and stuff. at that time, I was working in the circus as a trick rider on horses.
Wow.
And we got called in to do this job, 3 of us. For us, it was very easy because that's what we did. And in fact, so that's how I got into this business, was that day, and because of CG, very early CG in the 70s. So I'm used to it. It's a tool like anything else.
I didn't expect to ask this question, but since you brought it up, how was life in the circus?
Fantastic. That
Really?
was, that was my greatest joy. I went in the circus at 12 years old. I left home at 12 years old. Yeah, I know. It sounds crazy now, doesn't it? But again, it was like you were saying about there not being the internet. My dad was in the Navy, and so he buggered off to New Zealand with my mum for 9 months. That's it. We didn't even have a home phone in those days. So in 9 months, you're not going to talk into them. So in that time, I joined a circus and left home.
Wow, that's pretty incredible. I didn't, at 12 years old, especially, man. I mean, I couldn't put one foot in front of the other at 12 years old. You're out in the circus. As the films progressed with the prequels, you had to work with many different actors of various ages. I mean, it wasn't, obviously you had the younger side with guys like Hayden Christensen, but you brought up, the great Christopher Lee. Did you have to adjust your approach to fighting based on the actor and kind of where they were at physically?
Yeah. You always do. I mean, it might not look like it, but they actually all have quite unique styles. There's a familiarity to all of it, but they're quite unique. So he was more fencing. That's what he does. Yes, you go with how they move is the most important thing. So Jedi fighting for me, or Sith fighting as well, wasn't about forcing it onto them. It was about adapting what they had so that they were comfortable quickly. Somebody like Christopher Lee, that's going to happen very quickly because he's one of the greatest swordsmen ever. But also that's interesting because by the last one, I think it was the last one, he came to me with a letter from his doctor that said this man must not lift his hands higher than his elbows.
Wow.
Because of his blood.
Yeah.
And I took the letter to the producer and put it on his table. He wouldn't touch it, actually. He looked at it like that. And he looked at me and he said, he gave it to you, honey, not me. So good luck. And I went to George and said, what do you want to do? And he said, well, you have to change the fight. And it was a really good fight.
Mm-hmm.
And John Knoll and Rob Coleman, who are ILM, Industrial Light and Magic, CG, best in the world, yes. They said, we would like to take that on. We think we can maybe do his arms and his sword. So, in fact, in the fight in Revenge of the Sith that he did, he actually didn't move that much at all. He moved around like that. And his arms and his lightsaber are CGI.
As you were telling that story, I was trying to go back through the fight in my head to imagine, okay, wait, did he lift his arms at any point above? And I'm like, I thought he did.
Like that.
Yeah, but that was all CG.
Yeah, I couldn't believe it when I saw it. I mean, absolutely phenomenal what they did. I mean, he did some of it, but they did a whole load of it.
It is, having just rewatched Phantom Menace in theaters, it is unbelievable how well the CG, 19 to 25 years later holds up, because you never know. I mean, it really, CG has a tendency to age, and for those movies, what's that?
Definitely it does. Yeah.
Yeah. And those movies they still look really darn good. I mean, ILM obviously being what they are is a huge reason for that. And
John Knoll, who was our coordinator, he invented Adobe Photoshop on a 1 megabyte Mac.
Really?
Yeah, you look on the credits on Adobe Photoshop. That's his name. Him and his brother.
Wow. You once commented that you thought that Hayden Christensen was one of the most talented duelists that you'd ever seen. What was it about him specifically that impressed you so much while working on those films?
He's an athlete. He could have been a pro tennis player. Anything that he takes on, that sport-wise, he's got that killer instinct, but also perfect balance, perfect control. His movement is perfect. Different to Ewan. Ewan is equally as good, but way wilder. Yeah, Hayden could be anything he wants to be.
Do you feel like he was underappreciated in that role?
He was, and he knew it. I mean, he struggled with it himself. He struggled with the dialogue. It was a difficult time for him, but it's such a joy. I haven't seen him for a while. I saw him last Christmas, and it's lovely to see him now as a grown man. With a kid who's come through that. And he did go through it. Him and Jake Lloyd went through it. But Jake even more so. I haven't seen Jake for a long time, but guy, he got it bad.
Yeah, and I think if there's one of the really cool things that has come from this recent era of Star Wars is that people who are my age now, who grew up on these films, that generation is kind of getting more appreciation for what those guys did. There's a really cool clip of one of the Star Wars celebrations of Hayden Christensen getting a standing ovation, and you see him kind of tear up. You saw Ahmed Best get a similar reception there with because there's Star Wars is one of those things where it's kind of critic proof in a certain sense, where it's more so about the attachment that you get to the films as opposed to the actual films themselves. So to see my generation kind of grow up and appreciate these actors for what they were doing, it is very cool. I know you say that you're not on the internet a ton, but the prequels at the time, and even to this day, just Star Wars has become this thing that is highly argued and highly talked about amongst people. I've heard a quote often that says nobody hates Star Wars quite like Star Wars fans. I mean, people have a tendency to be very, very critical of it. Were you surprised at the time by the divisive nature of the prequels when they were released?
No, I wasn't. As I said, and George had told me that too. But you're making it for a generation, and that's what he said. He said you're going to have to wait for this. It's going to be 10, 15 years before people come to you and say thank you. And the weird thing is those people like they're all of age now, and that's their childhood, their youth, the same as it was for me when I was young. And probably these more recent ones will be for this next generation. Well, let's hope so. It doesn't seem to be at the moment. There seems to be a lot of discourse at the moment amongst the fans.
Yeah, I think that it's a little bit different, and we'll see. I mean, who knows? 10 years from now, it could be completely different because the people who grew up on those films are gonna have their voices be heard. But I think that there was the oversaturation nowadays hurts it for me. Where like growing up, I mean, I feel like an old man, but like growing up, it was okay. You got a Star Wars movie. We had to wait 16 years for Phantom Menace. And then you had to wait 3 years for the next one. And then after that, you didn't know if you were going to get more Star Wars. Like it was, you might get a video game or an animated series here or there, but now it's multiple shows a year, movies coming out. I feel like, and I'm not even saying if they're of quality, that's fine. But I just feel like as somebody who grew up on the prequel era, there was something so much more interesting about the mystique of you don't know what's next. You don't know when the next step is going to be. And I think you kind of come to appreciate those movies more over time because those were all you had when you were growing up.
They were, and it was also in-house. It was Lucasfilm with George Lucas as Lucasfilm. That was also an indie company. It wasn't a studio. He had absolute control of it. He could put out what he wanted to put out, and they were very clever with that. So they kept you guessing. Now they got to make money out of it, and so it's a different situation. And I think the only thing I have noticed now is just the law. The law, they don't seem to care about the law. And the law is why Star Wars has so many fans. It is like a religion. I mean, it really is like a religion. And for a great deal of people. And the law is important.
And it's, I think one of the reasons why the Lucas vision of Star Wars has endured as much as it has is because I think that the best, or at least the most talked about films or film series come from the idea or the mind of one or two people. It's not and not to say something that's corporate can't be of quality, right? But I just think that when you look at some of the best films out there, I think Lucas as Star Wars is a prime example. One example that I always use is the Christopher Nolan Batman movies. That's just 3 movies made by a really, really talented director. Yes, they feature a guy who dresses up like a bat, but Christopher Nolan's just a masterful filmmaker, and those movies have aged incredibly well because of that. I think there's something so fascinating about with Lucas. It was like watching a kid play in a $100 million sandbox to a certain extent, where he's playing with his toys, and there's. Again, if what they've done in the future, people can like, and that's fine. But there's something very fascinating, I feel like, about seeing that one guy's vision played out through the end.
You know what? I'm just thinking as you're saying that. It is interesting because I remember when we did in that fight, the Duel of the Fates fight, we had that quite early on because we used it as an audition for Ray Park.
Mm-hmm.
So we got that fight down. And so and that became that fight. It was a much bigger thing at first. But when I first showed it to him, he said, I don't know. He doesn't know about fighting. And he said, let Jet look at it. Jet was his kid at the time.
Yeah.
He's still kids. Right?
Yeah.
But Jet was 5. And he said, if Jet likes it, that's what we go with that. And Jet liked it. So then, and I think before with The New Hope, that's who he was making it for, 5 to 14-year-olds. So now The Acolyte looks to me like it's made for 16 to 25-year-old. I don't know, but I think it's made for an older group, and maybe that's where they've gone wrong. Make it for kids, get it right, make it for kids, and grow. Then they'll grow up with it.
Yeah, I think it's so much tougher now because we live in the age of.
You're right.
Internet, where I think everyone has their idea in their head of what perfect Star Wars should look like, and that's their own vision of it, and you're never going to make something that's going to fall in line with what everyone envisions as perfect Star Wars, unless it's Empire. I mean, that's probably the only one where people unanimously agree. Okay, this is not just great Star Wars. This is legitimate art. You brought up Ray Park, and one thing I was fascinated about is obviously Ray Park, began his career as a stuntman. Was the plan always for him to play Darth Maul, or was it just that he was going to do the stunt work for Darth Maul? I think it was Peter's.
He wasn't a stuntman then. He stunts in Britain is a business. You have to be an instructor in 6 sports. You have to do it's a serious business. You have to do an apprenticeship. I did 10 years apprenticeship under a stunt coordinator, and they'll teach you everything, but most of all, they'll get rid of the bravado. They'll teach you it's just a job, and it's a career. But so Ray was a gymnast, and he had been working. A friend of mine was doing a movie called Mortal Kombat, just before Phantom Menace, and he was using Ray as a gymnast. He was on it as a gymnast. So when I was looking for a Ray Darth Maul, he suggested him, so that's how I got in contact with Ray. Originally, there was a number of very large actors that were going to play that part, quite serious actors. I can't tell you who. But for me, it was always going to be stunt because, like I said to the Robin Gerland, the casting director, he's got 2 lines, if that. Yes, master, and one other line. And I said, the rest of it is physical, and it's 4 hours in makeup. That's a double. You're going to have to double that guy. It's a lot of work for everybody. Let's just go with a stunt person. And she said, okay, let's do that. I then wanted to get the right one. So I was taking my time a little bit. At one point, she came into my office with a stunt register. Here it is.
Oh, wow.
Right, that's the stunt register. And she came in with that and said, this guy is fucking perfect, right? He should look like a heroin addict. This guy that we need. What she didn't realize, she was showing me my own page, right? She just hadn't looked at the photograph properly. And I'm going, you're never going to get that guy. She's like, why? This is Star Wars. I said, Robin, that's me. Right? And she said, well, you're perfect. You should play it. I said, I can't play it. I don't have the time.
No.
I haven't got time to waste 4 hours in makeup every day. So that's how it became Ray. Ray came, we looked at Ray, he was absolutely perfect. He could do wushu, and he was a great gymnast, and those were the two things I wanted. So we fought tooth and nail for him to be Darth Maul.
It's hard to imagine that character having the aura that it had if it was played by somebody else. And I think
there's the thing, though, and it happens all the time in this business, is you never know. Like, you can be on a job and 4 actors that were going to play that part and didn't. Mm-hmm. And yes, the performance you get is amazing, but you never know what the other one would have looked like.
Yeah. No, for sure. I think it's come out in the last few years, and who knows if it's correct, that Benicio del Toro was being considered for Darth Maul. I don't know if that's.
I tell you who won. The one I was going with when it was around was Tricky. You might not know Tricky. He's a singer. There was a band called Massive Attack.
Yes.
Yeah, he's a singer in that. One of the singers in that. He also is a singer in his own right.
Yeah.
And he's this really cool singer, and. At one point, it was going to be him, and I would love to have seen his version of it. The fighting wouldn't have been as good, but
it would have been unique for sure. There's been so many, as we say, in the internet memes and little memories that have come from the Star Wars prequels, and one of the big ones is the high ground scene. And at the end of Revenge of the Sith, and I was talking to my producer about this, and he said that. There's kind of an interesting backstory behind that scene. And supposedly there was much debate about it, and that you kind of have a funny story involving Hayden. If you could just kind of elaborate on that.
Yeah. Well, only that I think that's Spielberg's idea, that scene. I might be saying too much now, but I'm pretty sure it is. Just the way that George hung on to it. We hated it. It's common knowledge we hated it. We had a different version for it, which we felt was better. We campaigned as hard as we could to get it changed, but George was having none of it. The funny story is, when you're writing these fights for characters, of course you're spending time with them in the day, and Hayden lived next door to me, so we spent a lot of time together, and we would eat every evening in a restaurant. Or we were living in Bondi Beach, mm-hmm. And where we were living, you had to walk up a hill, and there was quite a steep grass bank or a road that you could walk up. And the first time we went across the bank, and he fell over. He fell over like 3 times trying to walk across this bank. And in my head, I thought, okay, Vader is weak on a slope. You give yourself little things that help you when you're a choreographer. General Grievous had a cough. Mm-hmm. It's a great little detail, things like that. So if you can, when you're with these people and you see them in real life doing things, you can steal those little things. So that was I always thought, if he ever gets on a slope, he's got no chance. That's where you can get him. And so that's how sort of the high ground and all of that stuff happened. But we hated it. We didn't want it. It was another one of those things that came up last second on the day. We were supposed to be doing something else, and then we did that. Those things happen quite a lot when you're filming.
If you don't mind me asking, what was the original pitch of how that scene?
The original pitch was they came off of that big mast that fell over, that they swung, and I think they landed on some things that were floating in the lava. They didn't. They landed on the bank.
Okay. They
landed from the swing and landed on the bank. And immediately we had that he grabbed him by the throat. You can't see, I've got you by the throat now. Anakin grabs Obi by the throat. He's disarmed him too. His lightsaber's on the floor, and he's got him, and he says, listen, I'm really sorry. It has to be this way. And launches his lightsabers. He's going to cut his head off. And Obi, in a defense move, turns out of it, sucks his lightsaber in to parry that blow that's coming for his head. In the turn, goes through Anakin's arms. It worked beautifully because neither of them could see each other just for a second as they were turning. And the upshot was that Obi went through his arms and then through his legs in the same move, in a diagonal. So his arms got cut off and then his legs got cut off at an angle. We wanted to slide him off of his legs, onto the stump and down. It was a horrendous thing to look at.
Mhm.
And it didn't happen.
Did you film a version of that sequence?
So I do have it there, but I've stopped posting them online because people just keep nicking them and making fortunes out of them.
Yeah, I can imagine.
My channel's not monetized, and so I wanted it to be that way so that people could see it and didn't feel they had to pay, or they could give an opinion without having to subscribe, you know.
Yeah.
But we just keep copying it, and it's annoying. They copy it. I don't mind them copying it, but they say, "Oh, we found this amazing footage. No one's ever seen it." You know,
not citing sources, not giving credit. Yeah,
not even that. I don't mind that, but they could say, "Listen, you could go to this channel and watch it for free, in its rawest form, without some crappy effects on it." You know, if they stop doing that, I'll post them all again.
Right. You know, you did have a limited role in Revenge of the Sith as an actor, and I
didn't want to be in it.
Oh, were you kind of? Was that a George Lucas decision?
It takes a lot of time. If you do that, you've got to go get a wig, you've got costume. It's a day, you know.
And was it all the more frustrating that a heavy majority of it ended up being cut down?
No, we did it on purpose.
Okay, you were okay with that?
Yeah, we did it on purpose.
Okay, yeah, because I was
made it so horrible that you couldn't show it.
Oh, really? Okay, because I was going to ask, what was the original kind of makeup outlook for that scene? Because you do get shown in a hologram at one point at the very end, before the third act. But what was the kind of original look?
He stabs a small girl straight the way through her throat, holds her in it while he grabs another one, cuts his hair. You know, I mean, it was nasty.
Yeah, it's because it probably might have pushed things over to an R rating. That probably is a big reason why. They got it. 2 more questions for you. You know, one, there's still the way that people discuss the fights in these movies and now on the shows it remains very divisive. And again, I maybe nostalgia blinds me, but I love the prequel era of fighting. If asked, with all the things have changed, would you ever come back to choreograph Star Wars fights again?
Yeah, of course I would. I mean, like, I work all the time. I don't know how it sounds, but that was something 30 years ago that we did. I haven't stopped working since then. I still work. So for me, that's my job. And I loved doing Star Wars. And yes, of course I would. It would be difficult because, you know, he gave me carte blanche, and it was all on my own terms, and how the lightsaber was designed, the shape of it, everything like that was down to us. And so it would have to be that way.
Yeah, I feel like that's a tougher ask when you're under the corporate control of Mickey Mouse.
Yeah, listen, you can still do it. I'm under corporate control every time I go to work.
Fair, yeah.
And if you get a director that understands, you know what you're doing, then they'll let you do it, you know, because it makes them look good. So I face that battle every single day. I faced it this morning. We still did what we thought was the right thing to do.
Yeah, a lot of it depends on if you're working with the right people. How much freedom will they give?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I've seen some of them that are doing it now. Yeah, it would be a struggle, but yeah, I'll do it, and it's always a struggle. It's a creative business. It should be a struggle, you know. Sure. But it should be right. You can't have one person that doesn't really know about it. A lot of directors, of course, they know how to direct acting, but they've never been in a fight. They've never been in a sword fight. You know, so why wouldn't you get someone that's all they do?
Mm-hmm. For sure.
You know,
yeah, and I think it's a huge reason why the fights in those movies connected with people, and why they have millions of hits on YouTube. Going back and just rewatching those sequences alone, you know, the one thing about what Lucas has done with his films is, you know, very famously, there were the special editions of the original trilogy where he went back, he added color correction, added some digital effects, some of which were extremely controversial. I'm just curious, do you know, are there extended cuts of the prequel films that exist somewhere in the Lucasfilm vault, or did what we see ultimately be what his final vision was?
Well, I don't know if there are extended cuts, but there is, I mean, that much footage there's 3 more movies in footage, you know,
Wow.
of scenes that just went completely. They're entire scenes that go. Even from Phantom Menace, the Gungans there where they lived, that the entire set went. It was one of the best sets I've ever seen on Star Wars, and it was never even in the movie.
Wow.
Yeah, so there's a shed load of stuff.
Yeah, because I remember,
that fight you were just talking about that got shrunk, that got filmed in normal size.
wow.
So that's that's all there.
One other thing that I saw, and I wasn't originally going to ask this, but I saw a recent video that said that, was it true that Lucas originally wanted the dual fight of the heroes, the battle of the heroes, to be all shown in consecutive sequence?
It was 12 and a half minutes. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Did he want it to be like a one shot, like with no?
We did it. I mean, you couldn't because it went through 4 stages.
Right.
And we would start at one and go right the way through the stage and then into another one. But they could do it all the way through.
Wow.
So they could do that fight at pace for 12 minutes.
That's pretty remarkable. And especially
yeah, I've seen it. Somewhere I've got it where they're doing it. We did it outside in the road and went down the road doing it.
Anyone suffer anybody get whacked? I mean, with a few.
I mean, you do. Ewan broke my finger, but I broke his about a week later.
So it's counter, an eye for an eye, so to speak, on this side.
It was. I hit him on purpose.
Well, Nick, as somebody who's a fan of cinema and somebody who obviously grew up as a huge fan of these movies, and as I said, my first exposure to you was watching the behind the scenes stuff. I mean, thank you, for what you contributed to many of our lives, and as somebody who did all he could as a kid to try to recreate those fights in his basement with his own toy lightsaber. I genuinely appreciate the imagination and just the creativity that you put into this. I cannot imagine those movies without the artistry and the effort that you put into that. And obviously what you've done beyond Star Wars. I mean, I could talk to you all day, probably asking questions about other stuff that you've worked with, or you've worked on, like you said. I'm sure most of your interviews revolve around Star Wars, but you're a badass, man. And I appreciate everything you've done, and even more so, I appreciate you coming on the show. Really, thank you for joining us.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you. It's a shame we didn't get to talk about American football because I love that.
Oh, really? Okay. Well, the thing is, I was wearing different hats today because I just got done recording an American football podcast about the Detroit Lions who played last night and won in overtime. So we're definitely kind of we're getting the creative juices flowing here.
Interestingly, mine, what I like, it's like you when you were a kid, because I like John Riggins and Jerry Rice, but from back in the day, San Francisco 49ers and those kind of players. I loved it. They showed it here for a while, and I just loved it. What a great game! What a great set of rules it has.
It's incredible. It's the new national pastime here in
fantastic.
America.
We have soccer. You call it soccer. We call it football. But the rule: one referee, 2 idiots running down the side. It's a shambles. Whereas yours, the rules are the rules. I love that.
Fantastic. Well, maybe if we ever get you back again, maybe this will just be a straight football interview.
Yeah, let's do that.
For sure. Appreciate it. Thank you so much for joining us, man. It means a lot.
Thank you, Nick.
Thank you so much to Nick for coming on. Believe it or not, that was one of the more nervous interviews I've done, and some of it was the internet connection. I feel like I was stammering and trying and talking over him at points. I wasn't trying to. It's just I don't know. You guys know that I like to hear the sound of my own voice, but for some reason that one, in a positive way, got to me, because Star Wars is one of those things, even more so beyond sports. Star Wars is one of those things that literally and figuratively feels like it's a completely different world. And to know somebody who's been a part of Star Wars, it almost feels like you're interviewing somebody from another planet. And I grew up obviously watching the behind the scenes stuff and the fight choreography for those movies. And as I said in the interview, trying to recreate the fight scenes on my own, doing all the flippy dippy stuff that they did in those movies. That was so impressive. So some really cool stories. I mean, I think that this is going to appeal to a lot of Star Wars fans. He told us some stuff that I didn't know, and Austin, who's a huge Star Wars fan, I don't know if he knew. So I appreciated him being very open with some of the stories and telling us about a very unique era for Star Wars, but as I mentioned, also a very unique era for filmmaking, where it was not the internet that we have today, and there was much more secrecy. And I feel like because of that, creators were allowed to take a lot more risks. I feel like I think that in the age that we're in now, I'm not even saying it's a terrible thing, but I feel like you have to be a little bit more calculated with your decision making, or else you're going to have jabronis like me on social media who are going to rip apart your every decision. So a wonderful interview with him. I really hope that you guys enjoyed it. Different than what we've done in the past, but I've said from the beginning, well, I love interviewing Detroit sports subjects and coaches and athletes. What I want this show to be is a show where I interview people that I just find fascinating. And the guy who choreographed Duel of the Fates, that's very fascinating to me. And I hope it's fascinating to all of you as well. So next week, by the time you are watching this, we will have a guest lined up. We've recorded several interviews in advance, so I will tweet out who the guest will be and cross that bridge when we get to it. But no one's decided as of the time of this recording, but probably by the time of this uploading. Thank you very much for continuing to support this product. Look, what I get to do is a blessing with the content stuff. But I just want you guys to know, I finished recording a podcast last night at about 1 a.m. Austin finished the production side of things, is the real MVP of this, and sent it to me. I got it in the Google Drive at 5:37 a.m. And again, there's people out there who do much more strenuous gigs. I'm by no means an honorable, brave man, but I just want you to know, like, we are trying very hard to bring you the best product possible and to improve other people's lives, and hopefully at some point improve my own as well. So if you're watching this on YouTube, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, share it with your friends, hit that bell. That way you are notified every single time that I upload a piece of content to this wonderful website that is YouTube. You can find us on Apple Podcasts. You can find us on Spotify. Anything else? I don't know. I like the schedule that we have going right now with the I'll Say This and Chris and company. I think that I think the hard part is out of the way, which is I'm proud of the content. Next is growing the content. So thank you very much to everybody who tuned in for this. I hope that you all enjoyed it. Have a great rest of your day. Normally I say peace and happiness, but in this particular instance, I say, may the force be with you.
Remember, the force will be with you always.